Hello everybody, I am Clare Beresford, your host and CEO of Laurence Simons, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our latest episode of Summing Up, the legal podcast. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we provide fresh insights to help leaders in the legal industry prepare for and navigate the rapidly changing and evolving business landscape. Today, I'm joined by Daniel Winterfeldt, MBE, KC, Honourable, the General Counsel, EMEA and Asia at Jefferies. Before taking on his role at Jefferies, Daniel worked at a number of law firms in their US securities and capital markets practice areas, including Jones Day, Weil Gotshal and Simons, and Chambers have listed him as a notable practitioner. He also spent time at CMS UK creating and launching their International Capital Markets Group, including the firm's US securities practice. And during his time at CMS UK, Daniel acted as the Diversity and Inclusion Partner, and in 2012, he was named Innovative Lawyer of the Year at the FT Innovative Lawyer Awards. Alongside this work, Daniel is the founder and chair of Interlaw Diversity Forum, which works to foster inclusion in the legal sector for all diverse talent. He is also the founder and co-chair of the Forum for US Securities Lawyers in London and an adjunct professor at Hult International Business School. Daniel, you wear many hats, and so thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We're thrilled that you're joining us here on the Summing Up podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too, absolutely. So Daniel, every story has a thread, which brings us to where we are today. And what I'm curious to understand from you, Daniel, is what was your thread of wanting to be a lawyer? What did that look like?
So from a very young age, I knew that I wanted to engage in a career that allowed me to help people. And also I was interested in traveling internationally. So I've always been interested in language and other cultures. And I started studying Spanish when I was 15. I studied Hebrew before that in Hebrew school, evenings and weekends, all throughout my grade school and high school. So that's always been kind of a thread of where I've been interested in. And I, for a long time, wanted to do medicine and be a doctor. And I either wanted to do research in biology or I wanted to do become a psychiatrist. And then as I was sort of in university, because in America we do 4 years of undergraduate. So my undergraduate degree, I did pre-med. So I double majored in biology and Spanish. And during my junior year abroad in Spain, really realized I was kind of getting burnt out on school, and the idea of doing, another 4 years of medical school after my 4-year undergraduate degree, and then residency, and then specializing, you're looking at like a 10-year path after that. And, this way I thought, why don't I do law school? If I do law school, it's 3 years, you're in, you're out, you immediately start working as a lawyer. And it also seemed like it was much easier to have that international aspect to my career, because most people who work in medicine have sedentary practices that are quite geographically set. So I thought it aligned better with kind of what my interests were and where I wanted to go. And I guess it turned out that it worked. But I do think that part of that journey, which is a great lesson for everybody, is don't be too set in your ideas. I think when you're younger, you can have ideas about what you want to do. Like I talked once to a trainee who said, I want to be a law student who said, I want to be a derivatives lawyer. And I sort of had to like nicely challenge it and say, I'm pretty sure if I asked you what a derivative was, you couldn't tell me. And I'm also pretty sure that you just don't know enough about the law yet. Just focus on getting a training contract, focus on getting that opportunity, go through different seats. And if you're interested in derivatives law, then make sure one of those seats that you're at the right firm and have a seat in derivatives, but you really never know where your career's going to take you. So you have to always be kind of open to opportunities, flexible. It's good to have a plan. It's good to have goals, but the most important thing too is to enjoy the journey, to learn along the way. And if you aren't open to sort of detours or changes or forks in the road, you could really miss out on big opportunities that will take you to places that you hadn't even thought of before.
That is quite the route, and some brilliant advice there, because one of the things that we know that we have aspiring lawyers who listen to this podcast, and we always want to have that advice from leaders such as yourself that is about what is the future of our profession going to look like. You've had a mixture of both private practice and in-house experience. What inspired you to go down the in-house path as you moved from a partner in US securities and international capital markets to the general counsel EMEA and Asia at Jefferies? What was that move about?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I do think, people used to go in-house. I would say on average, kind of, 10 years ago, the in-house sweet spot was probably maybe 4 to 6 years, 4 to 7 years qualified. That sweet spot has now dropped. So there are much more in-house opportunities at more junior levels as in-house teams are growing and people are realizing, why am I paying a law firm to do some of this more commoditized work when those junior associates who do that work, I can just pay them a flat salary and it's cheaper to have them just do that work in-house. And so there's been a balancing of in-house teams versus law firms, where we still rely on law firms for a lot of our external work, but we tend to rely on law firms for that more complex work, sometimes some of the even more lower end commoditized work for smaller in-house teams, and that's all relative. But I would say for us at Jefferies, we rely on outside counsel for that most complex, most difficult work, and sometimes some of that repetitive lower end work. We will also work with law firms and see how we can do that in a cost-effective way. But definitely, there are more opportunities at more junior levels. But even if the sweet spot was still 7 to 8 years, I left at 23 years qualified. So I was in private practice for 23 years, 2 in New York, in London since 2000, and I moved to Jefferies in 2021. So it's 2020. Now I'm confused, but it's been 2.5 years. So I've been at Jefferies for 2.5 years. I really had thought about going in-house, but it is actually quite difficult to go from a partner level to an in-house position, particularly into a GC role. I think the general rule of thumb is that partners don't make good in-house lawyers at senior levels, just because I think the skill sets are quite different. How we work is really different. The structures are different. So I think that actually I understand that general rule. I think what's different about me, and you talked about all the different hats I wear, that is unusual for a law firm partner. Usually a law firm partner has a practice area and they do that practice. And maybe they bolt on, maybe they're also the diversity partner. But I think running kind of 2 sector-wide bodies, one on US securities law, one that started as LGBT inclusion and expanded out, and then also, kind of having a managerial role where you're putting together and running international capital markets. I'm also putting together and running the diversity inclusion program globally, like kind of what I was doing at CMS. I kind of had 5 hats. They're not full-time ones, but I'd say what I really have learned how to do is really juggle a lot of different tasks. And what you're doing and also what I've done a lot with that DEI work, which, when I started doing DEI work, it was like over here, and capital was over here. And a lot of the questions I got internally is like, why are you doing this work? What does it have to do with your practice? And later I started really connecting with clients on that work and talking to a lot of in-house counsel. So I started learning from my in-house network about their work, what they do, where their struggles were. And I started realizing what a huge piece of their job people and talent was. And that piece was growing and growing and growing. So this role that I am at Jefferies is quite perfect because my background is in, M&A, but mostly really capital markets. A huge part of my job is being head of IB legal for EMEA and Asia. So day to day, I'm very close to the IB legal team, and I'm answering questions and not in the weeds, but I'm definitely a lower level down. And then, across the rest of the business, there's sales and trading legal, there's employment legal, there's our corporate secretarial function that includes, outsourcing. So there's a wide area of groups where in capital markets, you kind of learn about all the different groups. Because if you're doing an IPO for a company, you're producing a prospectus, you're diligencing the company from top to bottom. So I was sitting as a junior lawyer reading all the leases for a corporation. I was sitting and reading all of their key material contracts. I was writing summaries of all their key litigation. So you're really well primed to understand a company from top to bottom. But also in this role, I'm using that IB expertise, I'm using that people experience, and I'm using my knowledge across sectors generally, because I've done a lot of work in the telecom sector, in the financial institution sector, in the real estate sector. And so in fact, I've covered the sectors that we focus on as a bank, plus other banks have been my clients. So I have that experience. So it all really has come together into this role for me. And it really is kind of a perfect fit. But it also takes, I think, vision for a GC. So Mike Sharp, our global GC, kind of, I think had a blueprint because my predecessor had a similar CV. And then I added on the diversity, inclusion, and equity piece, which, is very much part of the ethos and the values at Jefferies. So I think, I have to give Mike the credit for having that vision that I would be someone good to do this role, because I think that, not everyone would think that I was the perfect fit or the candidate for the job, and it works well. But, it is one of those things where you step back and you think, okay, do we want an in-house person? Do we want, a private practice partner for this in-house role? And most of the time the answer is no. But I would argue that you need to always, like all of this stuff when you're looking at talent, be kind of open about those criteria and be a little bit flexible, or you may lose, someone who's really well suited for a job if you're too prescriptive about what that looks like.
We see that all the time in our world at Laurence Simons, obviously, that sometimes clients are quite, I'll give you an example that, a FTSE 100 client who said they wanted another FTSE 100 general counsel, and you were like, well, there are only 99 others of those, and in your practice area there are only, in your vertical there are only X. So it's interesting, and I think what's fascinating from what you've described there, for some of those junior lawyers or who are listening to this, who are wanting to look at those leadership positions, and how do you get to those leadership positions that that they'll want at some point in their career. Is there any advice that you would share for them in terms of how you build that, or perhaps any advice you received during your career journey?
Yeah, no. So I think your point about, it's interesting because when I talk to recruiters, often what they tell me is, Daniel, it's not us limiting who's doing this work. It's our clients ultimately who are quite conservative or quite set in their ways. We try and advise them to do it differently. So one of the things I try and do to help the recruiting industry is when I meet with general counsel or in-house lawyers, or I meet with, people within management at companies to talk about talent, I always encourage them to visit that criteria. And it's a great example. If I'm looking for a CFO, if I say I only want a CFO who's been another CFO at a FTSE 100 company, how many women are even going to be on that list, mm-hmm. right? If you're lucky, there's 10, and I'm betting that it's not even that. So if you're then open to say, why don't you change that criteria to CFO or partner at big four accounting firm? Suddenly, your list of diversity across the board for characteristics mm-hmm. opens up, and you can't tell me that, an experienced partner at EY wouldn't make a phenomenal CFO for you, particularly if they know your sector well, they've audited maybe some of your competitors. So I think that's a really interesting point. I think for junior people looking to go in-house, as I've said, people now go in-house earlier. Mm-hmm. So I think you shouldn't miss that boat. I think you want to get that classic training at a law firm. I think particularly if you're in a complex area like capital markets, derivatives, structured products, you do need that sort of classical training, because the problem is when you go in-house, especially if you're at a bank, you go up to a level up here, and it's kind of like doing art. If you don't have that classical training at the bottom, you can't go off and become Picasso, one would argue, right? So you need that training, but you shouldn't miss that window, and you shouldn't be afraid to take an opportunity that comes along, because I think people do move in-house more and more, and if you miss that window, it does become harder and harder to reverse course. It doesn't mean if you're listening to this and you're a 6th year or you're a 7th year that you're dead in the water, but it does mean as you keep going up, it becomes harder. So I think what you want to do is find that opportunity at the right moment in time. Mm-hmm. And as you also said, the other thing I would recommend people to do is make sure you're broadening out. The biggest issue for someone coming from private practice to in-house is, what is your people management skills like? How is your EQ? How are you dealing with, conflict or difficult clients? And when you're thinking about how you deal with clients, that can also be how are you doing internally with if you're a junior associate, with mid-levels, with senior associates, with business services. So just how do you work with people? How do you project manage? trying to develop and work on those skills. Also, I think building a network is really important. So go to the Interlaw Diversity Forum, go to other events that are out there, either in your particular sector you're interested in or from a DEI perspective, but take those opportunities to build a network, build your people skills, work with people, hear from, because one of the things we spend a lot of time doing at Interlaw is having panel events where we platform people to talk about their journeys, to talk about where things went well, where they had challenges, how they overcame them. We know that the system isn't perfect, so we're not trying to fix people, but what we are trying to do is recognize where there are things that are less than ideal within the legal sector. So first of all, I think it's letting people know, you're not crazy. It's not you. Yeah. Many people have the same issues and challenges you have. And I think with imposter syndrome and with other things people feel, that's a really important message to get across to people. Because I think often what you see is like the swan syndrome. So everyone looks smooth and everyone looks polished at a law firm and they've all got the great suit. And, like, look how clean and wonderful my kitchen looks. And if you just went like over that way, you'd see like, a stack of laundry, you'd see a stack of, it's off camera always, but it's that swan who looks so elegant on top of the lake, but paddles underneath. Now, I think perfecting the swan is important because what people want to do is you want to build a relationship of trust with your clients. You want people come to you for advice and support. They have to trust you. They have to have confidence in you. So, they don't need to see you sweating the small stuff. They don't need to see you doing the work. But at the same time, we don't want to not acknowledge that there's a lot of paddling and a lot of ugliness that goes on underneath. So people who are successful, not only are you not successful and does that not happen overnight, but also it takes every day you're encountering challenges. So, I today have had a horrible day filled with difficult people, difficult challenges, difficult conversations internally, difficult conversations with law firms, difficult conversations with my clients internally. We're heading into year end. It's great. I love it. It is my job, but it's not easy. And we all have days and bad days. And being successful isn't about the absence of challenges. Being successful is about how you navigate them. Are you able to learn from those, brush yourself off, hit reset, get up the next day, start over, but bring with you not the negativity or the challenges, bring with you what you've learned from those experiences and how you can move forward. And sometimes maybe what you've learned is that person's just a difficult person and I've got to be careful with how I navigate them. Or maybe what you learned is I did something wrong in this situation and this is how I could have handled this situation better the next time. So I think developing those skills, so really understanding like who you are and what you want to do, understanding where you're at in your chain, looking for those opportunities. And while you're looking for the opportunities, really develop your skill set above and beyond just what your law firm's asking from you, but think about it, your career in a broader context and think about developing that skill set outside of just billable hours and deliverables.
It's interesting because you've spoken about success there quite beautifully, eloquently, and a topic that's come up quite regularly when we've had these summing up episodes with senior legal leaders is the concept also of resilience and how that's sort of a key ingredient to some of that success. Do you believe that resilience has helped you in your career?
Ooh. Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's fundamental because, as I've said, being successful is not the absence of challenges. You will have challenges, big and small, every day. And I think, as I've said, I think resilience is part of that process I talked about, which is learning to take on board. I think, some things you just want to set to the side, right? Some people are just difficult. Some criticism, if you're doing anything, as someone says, if there's no one criticizing what you're doing, you're probably not doing anything of value. Right. So you're always going to have that voice or that critic. If you're doing something that impacts 30 people, you're always going to have one person complaining, one person who doesn't like it. You have to learn to listen to that criticism and say, is there something constructive in this? Or is this just noise I'm going to tune out? And so you can't reach the level of arrogance where you don't listen to criticism, but you do have to have a filter to say, hey, is this something of value inside of this, even if it's been delivered in an unpleasant, difficult way, and take that on board and learn and move forward. But that, to me, is the process of resilience. The other part of that is, a word that's a little bit overused these days, self-care. the reason why I say it's been overused is because that's been developed for a generation of people who are living for service to others, whether you're a parent or you have caring responsibilities or you take on a lot within the workplace. If you're always giving to others, if you don't take care of yourself and replenish yourself, that's when self-care is really necessary. If you're already the center of your universe, if you're on social media all the time, if you think it's all about you, then self-care is not the message. Service to others is the message. The way those people need to open up and get better is by learning that by helping others, improving the lives of others, and being of service to others, you actually help yourself and you grow. Now, if you're doing that to the point where you feel like it's too much, then self-care is really important. So you need to get your sleep. You need to be eating, not just eating healthy. So, if you're in the office late, when you're doing those long law firm hours, get sushi, don't get fried food, don't get fast food, try and eat healthier, try and exercise and get to the gym. And I think we can fall into that trap, especially with the billable hour in a law firm, of thinking, I can't take that break and go to the gym. I can't take that break. Well, you can get healthy food delivered now anywhere with Uber Eats, so that's an easy part. But the gym and the workout is really important. And setting those limits and setting that time, it is a gift back because it's about the quality of the hours. I don't want to pay someone to bill me 14 hours a day because to me, you're getting about 8 good hours and the rest of it's wasted money, right? So, and these days the clients don't pay 14-hour days anyway, right? So you're going to end up discounting it, writing it out. It's not great, right? So what we really should be doing is thinking about replenishing ourselves, taking care of ourselves. It's like when you're on the airplane and they say, if the oxygen mask falls and you're with a child, put the mask on yourself first before you put it on your child, because if you pass out, there's no one there to help your kid, right? So we have responsibilities to others. We're all leaders within our organizations, no matter what level we're at. Even if you're a first-year associates tell us in our research, they gave me due diligence to do as a trainee. I was great at due diligence. I became a first-year associate. And suddenly they're like, great, now manage these 5 trainees on a due diligence project. And they're like, well, I know how to do due diligence, but no one taught me how to manage people, right? So learning how to manage those people, but also know that if you aren't at your best, you're not giving your clients your best, you're not giving your colleagues your best, and you're not able to do your role well. So that self-care is really, really important.
You touched briefly, or it's come through in passing, you've spoken about diversity, equity and inclusion, and it is something that I'd like us to delve into now because while we know that women make up 61% of the solicitors in the United Kingdom, if we look at in private practice, we only have 35% partnership of women in private practice, which has risen by 1% since 2019. But if we kind of carry that on, when we look at equity partners, that gets even worse, that it's only 12% in 2020, and that moved up 2% in 2022. These are figures from the Solicitors Regulatory Authority. So that's a slow change, and yet we have lots of evidence that the benefits of building diverse teams are undeniable, right? More profitable. Everybody's read those reports, and you have sort of since 2008, probably long before that, Daniel, but in 2008 you set up the Interlaw Diversity Forum, and you're a leader in this sector in the legal industry. How did you come to be so involved in this crucial issue?
So, I'm going to depress you even more and let you know that 12% number for equity partnerships was also that number in 2012. So we moved 2 to 3% in a decade when it comes to women at equity partner level. Although in 2022, we were at about 30 years of recruiting women at 50% levels. And you're right, most firms are recruiting women at 60% levels. So 30 years ago, people thought, great, we fixed the recruitment at entry level. We're going to step back and we're going to have all these women at the top. And it hasn't happened. People also point out maternity leave and think it's all about that. But if that were true, then you'd have women without kids ruling the universe, and those women don't exist either. And in fact, most women I know who are senior and successful do have children. So it's more complicated than that. And when you look across the board at other numbers, you see similar issues around disability, LGBT+, race and ethnicity, we have a challenge in the law firm. And when you look at social mobility, we have a challenge recruiting these people in. And if they come in, we have a challenge retaining them at law firms. And we have a real challenge keeping them up and getting them promoted and up the chain. A lot of firms can do the analysis and see that women don't leave, but they also don't go up, where men do. And there was a study by the 30% Club about 5 years ago that said if you walk into a professional services firm and you're a woman and a man walk in on the same day, the man is 4 times more likely to become a partner in the future than the woman sitting next to them. And at law firms, they found that number was 10 times less likely, or the man was 10 times more likely to become a partner. So these differences are less visible at entry level, but they play out more and more as you go up. And in fact, that retention point and where women and diverse talent leave is where those characteristics start playing out and where those challenges start manifesting themselves. It's difficult to perceive at entry level. It starts becoming easier to perceive and understand as you go up. It's also masked by the fact that at junior levels within law firms, people tend to go by PQE and it's lockstep pay. The minute you get out of that, funnily enough, around 6 years qualified, where women drop off and it becomes more discretionary, that's where things start falling apart, right? So I think that is a huge challenge that we have. And, I saw this within my experience, not just my personal experience, but the people around me, and being a diversity partner at Simmons & Simmons for 3 years and building their program, being a diversity partner at CMS and building their program and running it for over 7 years, because I continued consulting on that front while I was starting my next job. So they had me stay on at CMS to continue helping them. So I saw that. And so I started Interlaw because I think of my personal challenges, being gay, being Jewish. At the time, I knew that I was neurodiverse, but I was undiagnosed. I since had a diagnosis for ADHD. But, I think all of those things about you can be advantages. I think you learn from adversity, you learn from challenges. 3 of my 4 grandparents, I'm German, Russian, Ukrainian, Lithuanian. I was born in the US. So I grew up Jewish as a minority group. I mean, where I grew up, Jews were less than 10%. But we were a visible minority, and we all know that visible minorities get scapegoated, and, challenging things happened as I was growing up, some smaller, some bigger. And then secretly, I also knew that I was gay. That was very difficult because in the 80s, in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I grew up, it was very, very conservative. The general counsel passed a law saying that, sorry, not the general counsel, the city council in Cincinnati, when I was a kid, passed a law saying, just in case you're confused about LGBT plus equality, it is legal to fire people for being gay or lesbian. So they actually passed a law actively stripping LGBT people of their civil rights. They also arrested the curator of an art gallery for putting up Mapplethorpe prints because they said it was pornography, which is obviously homophobic. And had those been female nudes, I do not think someone would have been arrested and taken away. And if that's the path we're going down, they'd have to march into, the Cincinnati Art Museum and arrest the curators there for the various paintings with nudity, right? So very, very hostile environment. Reagan was all the rage. The AIDS epidemics had just started. But, the backlash against that and the homophobia about that was very, very palpable. It was really challenging. I came out when I was in college. And so I was open from my junior year. I was open all throughout law school. It was definitely, again, a challenge in law school. A lot of obstacles to overcome and battles to overcome, including having to fight to get the LGBT network onto the diversity committee. There was a diversity committee with African American network, an Asian American network, and a Latino group. Interestingly, I don't think there was a women's group back then, but there was an LGBT group, but we were not part of the committee. And I had to go through a big process working with the dean of the school just to get that committee to join. So that activism started early. Reverend Al Sharpton offered to commit a marriage for us anytime we wanted. He said he'd perform a marriage on the steps of Fordham. And we thought with our Jesuit university, that might not be the best way to use our activism dollars, although it might have gotten us headlines in the newspaper. But he was a great supporter and a really good ally. And that taught me early on, we're all kind of in this together when it comes to civil rights. We have an obligation, Sojourner Truth said, until we're all equal, none of us are equal. So that activism sort of retreated when I started working, because to be honest, as a young lawyer at these major firms doing cross-border international work, you're just trying to stay alive and do your work, right? I had fantastic work, particularly when I moved to London in 2000 and worked at Weil. I worked with Mike Francis, who's still head of the office, and we're still close friends, and he's a great supporter of my career. Mike made sure that I was on the best deals, doing the best work. I didn't always have the best experience with others, but Mike always made sure that my career stayed on track, and he looked out for me. And, without that training, that classical hardcore training, not just on the ABCs of the law, but also on procedure and on project management, those skills have served me my whole career. I then became a partner in 2008, and I thought, wow, I've seen my individual challenges. I've seen the challenges of others. I've seen the lack of diversity. I mean, when I moved to London in 2000, there's obviously a different history and a different ethnic makeup, et cetera, and diversity numbers are different in the UK, but it really was night and day in 2000. New York was so multicultural and so diverse. And, you look at Sex and the City, it's a great record of what New York was like back then. It really was that way. It was very multicultural, very diverse. I came to London and I walk in offices, and again, the history is different. The ethnic makeup was different, but it was weird for me to walk into an office where nobody was LGBT, nobody was out about disability or mental health, nobody talked about even their religion. I mean, I worked with people who were Jewish for 3 years who didn't tell me they were Jewish. Now, if you're not openly Jewish and you're working at Weil Gotshal, which is, a Jewish firm, and the origin of Weil Gotshal, Fried Frank, these firms all were created because the white Jew firm said, if you're Jewish, you can't work for us. So Jews had to go off and start their own law firms. So ironically, you're sitting in London. Mike Francis was openly Jewish as head of the office, but many of the associates with me did not even come out about that. So that was a weird environment where I'm openly Jewish, I'm openly gay. And for most of the time I was at Weil, there were a few other Jews. There were no other LGBT people. Maybe there was one person in the mailroom at some point. So it was quite isolating. And I thought, what can I do to bring people together, create a space where people could talk about issues, support each other, and really, change things. And that's what really brought me to starting Interlaw.
First of all, can I just acknowledge your courage and resilience, right? There is that bravery cannot be underestimated. And I think what we know is that people are literally standing on your shoulders, right? The fact that you were able to live your truth and then really be vocal about that in a way, or just or be open and honest about it if asked or if understood. Because what's really interesting, and I alluded to this earlier, is that the data is showing, in all of these companies that are more diverse, they're more profitable because you've got that diversity of thought, you've got that diversity of outlook and approach, and all of those things that mean that you are able to solve problems and think of things in a different way. And we've spoken about talent earlier and what that pathway looks like. Do you have any thoughts or understanding about how you create and build diverse teams, and more importantly, also then retain that talent?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, thank you for saying that I'm brave, but for me, it didn't feel like bravery. It felt like I had to make a choice. So I was raised by people who said, you never know when your own country is going to turn on you. You never know when you have to leave. I was told, keep your passport next to your bed, make sure you have portable wealth, be on alert or be on the lookout for anti-Semitism, be careful about your name not being put on lists. So I applied all of that to being LGBT. I mean, I marched in Pride for the first time in New York in 1998. And literally, as I'm walking down Fifth Avenue, and back then it was very much a political march. There were no floats and dancers and pop music. It was political. We were holding political signs. And as I'm walking down Fifth Avenue, A, I was afraid of being physically harmed. And B, I was thinking, well, if the government wants to compile a list or people want to figure out who's gay, you're going to go on this list. Like, I wouldn't sign up to email lists. I was very careful about not being identified as LGBT. And I really think I reached a point walking down Fifth Avenue in 1997, 98, the summer of 90. I started in 95. So it was the summer of 96 that I just said, you know what? I don't care. If there's a list, I'm going to be on the list. Everyone knows I'm Jewish. I'm just going to have to live my life. So I just decided I'm just going to live my life. And I would rather live my life with the consequences that might be down and up. And that's, I think, for anyone who's diverse, yes, there are downsides to being open. Yes, there are downsides to disclosing, but there are also upsides. So doing this work has opened networks to me. I found allies, I found supporters. So I think the downside you're going to live with anyway. I mean, many diversity characteristics you can't hide anyway. So you're going to get them. If you don't tap into the upsides of networking, support, allyship, service and support of others while being an ally to them, you miss the benefit. So that to me, is I feel like I've had to be authentic and I've been hugely rewarded for that. So I think the negative stuff I've experienced, I probably would have been through anyway, but I wouldn't have had most of the benefits without being open. So for me, it was less about bravery and more about authenticity because I didn't want to live my life that way. I don't like lying. I'm not good at lying. I'm a terrible liar and it makes me miserable, right? So I felt like have a choice, but to just make a choice to be me. And so when it comes to talent and organizations, I think that you're right. The business case is there. I mean, to me, there's three levers for organizations, right? One lever is it's the right thing to do, and that works with some people. The next lever is there's a business case, and that business case says if you're diverse and inclusive, you will get better results, right? It's about diversity of thought and diversity of experience and everyone bringing that to the table, particularly when you're in people services like your work, my work, even an investment bank, a law firm, professional services, we are giving ideas and advice to clients. If we don't have the best people with the most experience bringing that to the table, getting the best results for our client, we're not delivering our best. And that will lead to a better bottom line, better outcomes, more work. And as you said, there's a stack of research. If people don't believe that, our clients are all demanding it. Our clients at the bank are demanding it. We as clients of law firms are demanding it. So we need to be delivering that. So I think what the question then is what is it that we need to be doing? So to me, one of the places we're lost right now in this space is people have sort of lost their way on what diversity, equity, and inclusion work is. There's too much performative work. There's too much, I call it jazz hands diversity. You're putting on a show. And look, there's space for those things. Thank you for your International Women's Days breakfast. Thank you for your mentoring programs. Thank you for sponsoring these awards, or maybe not thank you. Excuse me. But at the end of the day, if those things aren't moving the needle on those numbers we talked about, that is not a good way to spend your time and money. So if you want to do an International Women's Day breakfast, that's great. But you better then also be investing in coaching programs for women, investing in sponsorship programs for women, monitoring those numbers and seeing is where you're spending your money and what you're doing moving the needle. You think about these big firms who do these giant blowouts that are diversity themed, where they're spending $50,000 in a night, and there's other things they could be doing. I mean, think of how many coaching hours you could buy for your senior talent that are diverse to retain them and help them go up the ladder with 50,000 pounds. And you know what? Tell your clients, you know what? We're getting rid of the knees up every year that we do. And instead, we're going to focus on investing that money in these talent programs because you know what? We've been looking at our numbers and they're not where they need to be. So I think the most important project that I'm working on is on the UK Model Diversity Survey, because what that's done is set up a program where clients can sign up. We can push out a survey through the Interlaw Diversity Forum to law firms to fill out. It's detailed. It gets to the heart of culture because it looks at headcount, hiring, promotion, attrition, top and bottom earners in the partnership, top 30 client partners, law firm leadership, and other factors, all through the lens of the main strands of DEI plus social mobility. So you can look at a law firm and you can see exactly where they're at, and then you can start having conversations with them saying, this is amazing, this is great, and here's areas for you to work on. And where the areas are great inside the program, we're going to be sharing that with the whole program. So all the clients involved and all the law firms involved will be platforming those firms to say, this firm's doing excellent on equity partner representation for women. What are you doing that's transferable that others can replicate? This firm's doing great on recruiting diverse disabled talent or LGBT plus talent into the trainee level. What are they doing so we can replicate that? And then let's think about what we're learning from other people's race programs that are really effective at retention that can then be applied to retention across the board. So to me, it's about getting to the heart of the data, being open and transparent about that data with your clients, and then all of us collaborating to move forward, because clients have all the same challenges and all the same issues. I mean, if you look at a bank and you look at our gender pay gap report for a bank, it's not that different from a law firm's gender pay gap report. We all have work to do. We may be a little bit farther ahead in the financial institution sector, but we all have similar challenges. So how do we work together? So to me, the real switch and the change that we need within the legal sector is that openness, that transparency, and that honesty about where we're doing well, where we have challenges, and also recognizing we're all at a different place on our journey. So for me, it's not about, here's my 6 key firms and I want them all to be the best. I'm going to take them where they're at and then ask them to work on progress. And progress means moving the key metrics for them. And, you know, if you say I focused on race, ethnicity, and LGBT plus these 2 years, and look, here's the results and the numbers, here's where we're having success, that to me is all I need to know, right? And I don't care if my favorite firm or my best firm is the bottom. All I want to do is see them moving up. And as you said, if we believe in the business case, it's going to lead to even better results for that firm, even better outcomes. And we, as in-house counsel, are stuck hiring our talent from these law firms. So if they're not hiring the best, we're not getting the best. So digging into law firm recruitment and helping them with that, digging into how they do retention, digging into promotion, and making sure we work as a team on those issues, because that helps me as well. If my key senior associate who's doing an area of work for Jefferies walks out the door, they walk out the door with all that institutional knowledge, all that experience. That's going to cost me money training up the next associate. They're going to be that much less efficient. So it's also in my benefit to make sure that person's rewarded, that person's retained, and they're sticking around to do the work. And I'm helping them get to partnership and helping them progress. And I think that's where we can be more active as clients. So I think really digging in and not just showing up to events and being like, oh, is this a wonderful event? Or like, thank you for your mentoring scheme. Thank you for your check to charity. Thank you for your pro bono. All of that work is incredibly important, but it's all CSR. It's not diversity. If it's not about the recruitment, retention, and promotion of diverse and socially mobile talent, to me, it's not DEI. And 90% of what people label as DEI is just not DEI. So if we go back to the numbers, what are the key metrics and what's working to move them? I think the whole industry can reframe and refocus. And, you know, honestly, I do believe that the UK Model Diversity Survey is the program that we just all need to be getting into to do that.
We will definitely link. I know we can put a link up there so we can really encourage people to participate in that and to learn. And, you know, it's Maya Angelou, isn't it, that says when you know better, you do better. It's absolutely, yeah. It's literally about there's so much in what you say that we can unpack here. But the key point is when you measure something, you can literally see the progress in it. And I think that we will absolutely put that out there, and anything that we can do at Laurence Simons to help promote that is our duty and our responsibility, really. Look, I think it's if I may, you know, Daniel, you and I could speak about this all day, but you also have your day job and your long career in terms of you know, what you do at Jefferies and what you previously have done in your law firm career. And I think what's really going to be quite insightful for our viewers, the UK is in a pretty unique place compared to its European neighbours, because it's a sort of acting as a stage, for international institutions to do their business, and the US sort of legal market, and the US law firms that have come into London. So I think that your insight into the US market would be extremely valuable for our people who are watching this. So if we might just dip into the US securities market for a moment. I know nothing about it. I do not declare myself as an expert, but what's the most single interesting thing that's happening right now in the US security market, and how do you think this is going to impact business in 2024?
Well, look, I think when it comes to US securities law, it's always really a challenge, because what you're doing is you're taking a system from another country, and what's unique about the US is our securities regime is global. So, most people limit their laws to their own country. An exception in the UK over my career has become the Bribery Act. So the Bribery Act here in the UK is also global, and it actually goes further than US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So where the US prohibition on bribery and corruption is mostly limited to government bodies or agents working on behalf of governments, the Bribery Act goes broader, and it's any payments or facilitation. So that's an example that's a rare one. But the US securities, my entire career, have had global application. It's why I came over here as a US securities lawyer, and why you see so many Americans here practicing securities law, because also how you do securities law in London is very different from what you do in New York. If you're sitting in New York, you're doing IPOs on the New York Stock Exchange, you're doing IPOs on NASDAQ, you're working on registration statements with the SEC and filing them. Ever since Sarbanes-Oxley in 2003, we don't do that here. So what we focus on is, how do you not register? What are the private placement exemptions? How do we use them? So we're looking at the rules from kind of the other end of the telescope. And I think that's always been challenging, because also the US rules, they're not simple and straightforward. If you're a listed company on the London Stock Exchange, you go to the listing rules and there's 90% plus of what you need to know. In America, you've got statutes at the federal level. The federal government, Congress, have delegated authority to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, known as the SEC, our version of the FSA. They then promulgate rules and also guidance underneath them. They also publish FAQs. They publish no action letters, which means if you do the following, if there's 5 requirements and you do 4 and you can't do the 5th, then we'll say that's okay. Those are issued as well. So there's no one place for all of these rules. You've got to learn how to take this amalgamation of rules, learn how to stick them together. You have to learn how to kind of get behind them and say, okay, what's the SEC trying to accomplish? And then kind of come up with layering that on top of UK or whatever other foreign law is involved to make sure it's legal. And then you also have to look at market practice and what's commercial to come up with a solution here in the UK. So it's really, really hard. A great example of what's going on right now is the UK government is looking at reforming how we do capital markets offerings. They're looking at reducing when we need to do prospectuses and have offering materials, lowering the thresholds, lowering the dollar amounts to make it easier and easier for companies to raise money. But the issue is the primary security we have when we do an offering with a document is we issue a 10b-5 disclosure letter, which follows the US fraud standard, where law firms do due diligence, they do drafting sessions, they do documentary due diligence as well, and we get together and put together a letter that says everything material is in the document and there's no material omissions in the disclosure document. If you don't have a disclosure document, and this proposal would eliminate disclosure documents for a huge range of public offerings by companies, you can't get this letter. And that letter for a bank advising a client is an automatic defense in a court of a fraud case. So if there's an issue in an offering, they're going to sue the issuer, they're going to sue the banks. But if the banks have done their own due diligence, if they have a 10b-5 letter, and if they have the right kind of comfort letter from auditors, that through those 3 things equal an automatic defense, which means that whoever's bringing the suit has to prove that you did something wrong. So without a disclosure document, you can't get that letter. So we've got kind of a market issue where if this government thing goes through, what are we actually going to do in market practice? Because A, our investors going to be happy? They might ask for this disclosure anyway. But from a U.S. securities perspective, particularly U.S. banks like my bank, which require 10b5s in almost every deal, we're going to say, hey, everyone, I think we're going to have to do a prospectus, even though it's not required, because we're going to need to do it in order to get the protections we need on this transaction, particularly when you get to really large size deals that have large amounts of those deals going into the US. So I apologize if that got too technical or too complicated, but it's kind of an exciting time to be a US securities lawyer. And it's a really interesting issue that really is impacting the market. And we're all having this debate ongoing. There have been draft rules that have been put out several times for the market to comment on. We're, I think, in another one of those comment periods now. So it's just a very interesting space to see where there's a push from the government to make these amendments and changes. But again, we have elections next year. Will they go through prior to the elections? If we see a change in government after the elections, will these proposals be dropped? We don't know. So yes, it's riveting if you're a U.S. securities lawyer or a securities lawyer. So I hope that was of interest to some people.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what's fascinating, isn't it, is that the SEC has very long-reaching arms, right? That it's wonderful to see. Depends on your the way. It is interesting. It is interesting to see that from a global global world, global economies. Many companies are global in their nature. So we know that the SEC is now looking to make changes to the Investment Company Act names rule, which is basically about aiming to prevent greenwashing and the human capital management disclosure. And it's going to include DE&I reporting. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on this change and where you sort of see that ESG regulation in the US heading.
Yeah, so I think, to your first point about how interesting it is, the SEC's reach, it's not just that they have reach globally, because I think now we're seeing more cooperation among international regulators. But the reason why I think we really get the SEC's attention, the rules are pretty much the same, but the level of enforcement activity is higher than anywhere else. The level of outcomes that come out of it are higher. If things reach a criminal level, the SEC cooperates with the Treasury Department and the Justice Department, and you can find really large fines. Usually settlements are joint settlements between the two, and you see really big outcomes, right? Because the outcome and the amount of the fine is based on looking at your balance sheet and making sure that it's going to have an impact and a change in behavior. And they're looking to get those headlines as well. So that's also why they went after kind of Martha Stewart for insider trading, because she's a household name, and Martha going to jail, I think, really kind of rocks the world. And that's what they want. They want those headlines to remind people, we're here, we can see you. Don't think you're going to pick up the phone getting off your private jet and call your broker to do an inside trade right after you receive a call from an executive from that company, because we will hunt you down, we will find you. And I think, they're always looking for that opportunity to get that headline to remind people. So that's, I think, a big difference. And I think, the FCA has become more active in enforcement. The fines are growing, but, it's still more active, higher. When it comes to these changes around ESG and diversity, we're also seeing changes come in some of the listing rules as well. So they're looking at changing the New York Stock Exchange listing rules. So I think there's definitely a movement towards looking at more disclosure in this space, which is meant to then put pressure on people. We have activist shareholders who are really putting pressure around environmental and more now around people, whether it's people pushing for more representation of women in the boardroom. You see these activist shareholders coming forward. And then you have a mixture of potential rule changes coming, listing rules changing, activist shareholders putting pressure on people. And then you also have, as I said, clients putting pressure back on organizations as well to do more in this space. So I think the way forward is change. And you also see banks now. So we've seen Goldman Sachs come out and say they need a certain level of diversity at the board level, or they won't represent you and work with you as an issuer and as a client. So I think really the convergence is a movement forward in this space. I think it's a movement towards, disclosure and representation. But, I kind of go back to the beginning of our talk about if you have diversity without inclusion, you don't really get a change. So you look at the 30% club, and that
Mm-hmm.
was hugely successful in getting women on boards, but because they didn't specify whether they wanted non-executive or executive directors, boards just, well, the club was made up of all men plus the founder, so there was one woman in the club, and and everyone happily shifted the change, but that change only came to non-executive directors, which means the boardroom changed. But I'd kind of argue, if you haven't changed the C-suite and you haven't changed what happens inside the company 365 days a year, it
Mm-hmm.
hasn't gone far enough, and it's not going to have the impact that you're looking for. While it's great to have those non-executive director voices in the room, it's also critically important that those diverse voices, as we've talked about, to get the benefits of diversity, they've got to be in your building, affecting decisions every day, baked into your company from the top to the bottom. You need to look at every system and procedure you have to really make sure you get the benefits. And that's the problem. People do this stuff poorly, or they're doing performative stuff, and then people don't see a change and they go, oh, look, what a waste of time all this stuff is, right? Oh, hey, why are we doing all this stuff? We're not seeing an impact on the bottom line, but it's because they're not doing it the right way and they're not doing it well, which leads us back to looking at the data, tracking the data. And, we also see gender pay gap reporting coming in here. People are talking about ethnicity. But to me, if you're talking about ethnicity because of the numbers, you also need to be talking about disability. You need to be talking about LGBT pay gap reporting. Both those groups are as large or larger than the ethnicity group, particularly if you look at it's important to think of across the board. So I think the point is change is coming. While there is a little bit of a backlash right now, I think, against DEI, and there's this anti-woke movement, I don't think it's going to get rid of the heart of the work. And I think when you do the work right, when you do it with inclusion in the UK, when you look at all the diverse characteristics and you include social mobility, which is such a key driver. I mean, the whole system here was built around class. And it definitely is something that's systemic here in the UK. If you do that work and you do it well, it resonates with everyone. If you focus on inclusion, if you focus on allyship, you're going to get your company to the right place, and you're going to get all those great benefits that McKinsey and the Harvard Business Review and all that research tells us. But we've got to get focused on the right work in the right way that really is meaningful and impactful, and that aligns and works for your business. It's not a one size shape fits all. I saw this trend on social media. I'm now going to drop it in my company. Unfortunately, this stuff is hard. There's no silver bullet. It means really looking at your data, understanding your business, looking at your staff attitude survey, and creating something tailored to you, your investors, your clients, and what really makes sense and works inside your business.
That's fascinating, Daniel, that we're seeing that potential sort of movement. And I think what's always been interesting is how the US has often led on these things. You mentioned earlier that when you moved to the UK in the early 2000s, it was very different to what you'd experienced in New York from that D&I space. But one of the things that I think is interesting that we see in London, and this is perhaps London specific, so I apologise to those who are watching this that aren't in the UK, but we know that there's always been a sort of a private practice competition between US and UK law firms. And we know that all regions are losing some of their market share to transactions to the US. Are you seeing that these markets are changing? I suppose if I frame the question, do you think that UK law firms can compete with their North American counterparts?
Well, I think so, but I think that they need to be innovative. And I think, as we've talked about on the diversity side, about firms really need to dig in and do that cultural change work in a serious way that complements also the different approach between US and UK law firms. So to me, UK law firms sometimes are just a little more traditional, a little more cost concerned. So if I talk to coaches, they tell me that US firms are much better clients because they're much more willing to get coaching for their diverse talent. And I think that's one of the reasons why US firms are, doing a little bit better, because they're more nimble. They're able to be, make bolder decisions and be a little bit more entrepreneurial. So I think really UK firms are absolutely fantastic. And if I look at the key firms I work with, it's actually a perfect balance of US and UK, so to speak. But I think most of them would say they're international firms. But I think that, the firms that are client focused and client led and are able to be nimble and innovative will survive and will do really well. For those people who stay back in an old an old environment and don't modernize, I do think that they're going to struggle in the future.
Daniel, thank you so much for your time today. It has been extraordinarily insightful, and I know that our viewers and listeners will echo what I've said, that I think this has been an extraordinary summing up. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Really honored to be here. Have a great rest of your day, Claire.